It starts quietly, the way the most dangerous shifts always do. Not with sirens or public orders, but with names written down, intentions discussed behind closed doors, and power imagined as something personal. This isn't about campaign rhetoric or exaggerated bravado anymore. This is about what happens when grievance turns into planning, and planning turns into preparation. When the lines between accountability and revenge begin to blur, institutions don't collapse all at once. They weaken from the inside. And once that process begins, stopping it becomes far harder than anyone expects. To understand why this moment is so unsettling, you have to step back from the personalities and look at the mechanics of power. In a functioning democracy, investigations are meant to operate independently of political pressure. Agents follow evidence, prosecutors apply the law, and outcomes are determined by courts, not personal loyalty. That separation is what allows accountability to exist at all. Once that boundary erodes, the system doesn't bend, it breaks. For years, Donald Trump has framed law enforcement scrutiny as a personal attack rather than a legal process. Every inquiry into his conduct has been described not as oversight, but as persecution. That mindset matters because it transforms neutral institutions into perceived enemies. When accountability is rebranded as betrayal, retaliation starts to feel justified to those who accept the narrative. The hostility didn't emerge overnight. It intensified with each investigation that produced consequences Trump didn't like. From the Russia probe to impeachment, and later to classified documents and election-related inquiries, the pattern remained consistent. Investigators weren't wrong in his telling. They were malicious, not public servants, but conspirators. Once that framing takes hold, it creates a moral permission structure where punishment feels righteous. What makes the current situation different is the move from rhetoric to documentation. Talking about revenge at rallies is one thing. Quietly cataloging individuals, mapping out consequences, and revisiting those plans in private conversations is something else entirely. That shift signals intent. It suggests that retaliation is not a hypothetical talking point, but a future administrative priority. This is where the danger escalates. Federal agents are not political actors. They do not run for office, they do not campaign, and they do not set policy. Their authority comes from law and procedure, not ideology. Targeting them for doing their jobs sends a message that obedience to the law is conditional on who holds power. That message doesn't just affect one investigation. It echoes through every future case involving political figures. Fear is an efficient deterrent. If investigators believe their careers, finances, or freedom could be threatened for pursuing sensitive cases, hesitation becomes rational. Over time, that hesitation reshapes behavior. Lines of inquiry are avoided. Decisions are delayed. Aggressive oversight gives way to caution. Accountability weakens without a single rule ever being changed. The implications extend far beyond any one individual. Federal agencies rely on continuity and institutional memory. They are designed to outlast administrations, precisely so that justice is not reinvented every 4 years. When a political leader signals that loyalty matters more than legality, that continuity collapses. Agencies stop functioning as neutral enforcers and begin operating in survival mode. This also creates a chilling effect outside government. Witnesses notice when investigators are punished. Whistleblowers take cues from how truth-tellers are treated. Cooperation dries up when people believe speaking honestly carries personal risk. The justice system doesn't need to be formally dismantled to become ineffective. It only needs enough fear to slow it down. What's unfolding is not just a dispute between a politician and law enforcement. It's a stress test of whether institutions can withstand personal vendettas backed by the promise of executive power. The outcome of that test doesn't depend on legal theory alone. It depends on whether norms still matter when they become inconvenient. At its core, this moment forces a fundamental question into the open. Is the justice system a public trust or a personal tool? The answer determines whether laws apply equally, or only until they threaten someone powerful enough to demand revenge. What makes this situation especially alarming is how familiar the pattern feels when viewed over time. This isn't an isolated impulse or a sudden overreaction. It fits into a long-running cycle where perceived disloyalty is met with punishment and restraint is interpreted as weakness. Anyone who steps into the path of accountability becomes recast as an adversary, regardless of their role or obligations. The target doesn't have to be political. It only has to be inconvenient. We've seen how this dynamic plays out with individuals who once operated well within the same orbit of power. People who testified under oath, followed internal procedures, or fulfilled legal responsibilities found themselves publicly attacked, professionally sidelined, or socially isolated. The lesson delivered to observers was unmistakable. Compliance with the law offers no protection if it conflicts with personal loyalty. Over time, that lesson reshapes behavior far more effectively than any formal decree. What changes now is scale and intent. The focus is no longer on one or two high-profile figures. It expands outward to include career professionals whose names are largely unknown to the public, but whose work forms the backbone of institutional accountability. These are not policymakers or political rivals. They are functionaries whose power lies in process, not discretion. Targeting them strikes at the infrastructure of enforcement itself. The threat doesn't require follow-through to be effective. The mere possibility of retaliation alters decision-making. When people believe their future may depend on staying invisible, they behave differently. They document less. They defer more. They choose safer paths. Over time, this quiet self-censorship becomes normalized, and the system adapts around it. Not because anyone was ordered to comply, but because survival demanded it. This is how institutional decay often begins. Not through dramatic purges, but through the gradual erosion of confidence. Agencies start asking not what the law requires, but what the consequences might be. That shift doesn't announce itself. It shows up in smaller decisions, postponed actions, and investigations that never quite materialize. The public rarely sees what didn't happen, which makes the damage hard to quantify and even harder to reverse. There's also a psychological component that's impossible to ignore. When authority figures signal that enforcement itself is a punishable offense, it creates a moral inversion. The people tasked with upholding rules become the ones at risk, while those with power move closer to immunity. That inversion corrodes legitimacy. Trust in institutions weakens not because laws change, but because enforcement becomes selective in practice. For those inside the system, the dilemma is profound. Speak up and risk becoming a target, or stay silent and watch standards erode. Neither option preserves integrity. One invites retaliation, the other enables normalization. Over time, capable professionals leave, either through resignation, retirement, or reassignment. What remains is an institution less experienced, more cautious, and increasingly hollowed out. Outside observers often underestimate how quickly this process accelerates once it begins. Fear compounds. Each visible act of retaliation reinforces the next. The absence of consequences for threats becomes its own signal. It tells everyone watching that boundaries are negotiable, and that power, once claimed, is rarely surrendered voluntarily. This isn't about one election cycle or one set of grievances. It's about whether the machinery of accountability can survive sustained pressure from someone who views restraint as betrayal. Institutions are resilient, but they are not invulnerable. They depend on shared expectations as much as formal rules. When those expectations collapse, rebuilding them takes far longer than dismantling them ever did.